点情的血，那点完的血，菜的酒店的发黏了，挺特别的，绕前头一堆死人，几个逮着个，几个逮着个从一个笼大，一个小孩爬着个，向他草上爬，那是我弟弟，哇哭，喊妈妈哭。
What you have just heard are the terrible memories of a survivor of the Nanking massacre, the campaign of extermination undertaken by Japan in eastern China. The contempt of the Japanese soldiers for that people was evidenced by shootings, torture, and even a morbid contest between two uniformed men who competed to kill the largest number of citizens using samurai swords. Their names were Tsuyoshi Noda and Toshiaki Mukai, and they soon became a symbol of the lack of scruples of the Japanese Empire. The myth of the two soldiers who riddled more than 100 people is one of the darkest chapters in the history of the archipelago, and today we are going to tell you all its morbid details. Let's go back 90 years in time to witness the horror. All conflicts have their dark legends, stories that show the most savage and brutal side of an army. In the case of Japan's invasion of China, known as the Second Sino-Japanese War, this is reflected in the Nanking massacre, a series of crimes carried out between late 1937 and early 1938 by imperial troops against the population of the then capital of the Republic of China. After capturing Shanghai in October 1937, the archipelago's soldiers moved north, conquering Nanking in the Battle of December 13, 1937. The local government, headed by Chiang Kai-shek and the commanders of the Nationalist Force, abandoned the area before the entry of the Japanese army, leaving behind thousands of soldiers trapped in a city practically under siege. They were easy prey for a bloodthirsty enemy. The massacre occurred over a period of about 6 weeks after the occupation, and accounts of those crimes come down to the present as echoes of one of the most savage times.
In Nanjing, the Japanese soldiers commit unspeakable atrocities and engage in a campaign of mass killing, which over the course of 2 months will claim the lives of as many as 300,000 civilians and numerous unarmed Chinese soldiers.
Among the many barbaric acts reported during that campaign of annihilation, one of the most incredible involved 2 Japanese officers who wagered on who would kill 100 people first, using samurai swords as their main weapon. The amazing thing is that this challenge is known thanks to an infamous newspaper article. In December 1937, the Tokyo Nichi Shimbun newspaper reported in a patriotic tone the bet between the 2 officers who had decided to compete to see who could kill more enemy soldiers using traditional methods. They were Lieutenants Tsuyoshi Noda and Toshiaki Mukai of the 116th Division of the Japanese Army. Soon their names were very popular in the archipelago, being seen by the Japanese population as a kind of heroes who had traveled to China to dominate the enemy nation and impart much-needed justice.
13th of December, 1937. The 6th and 116th Divisions of the Japanese Army were first to enter Nanjing, facing little military resistance. The Japanese Army, including Sub-Lieutenants Toshiaki Mukai and Tsuyoshi Noda, engaged in random murder, wartime rape, looting, arson, and other war crimes. They hunted down and killed suspected Chinese soldiers and summarily arrested thousands of young Chinese men.
According to the newspaper articles, in the days following the occupation, both Mukai and Noda not only reached the target number of deaths, but exceeded them. Without being able to determine who had reached it first because they had been separated during the conflict, the men planned to continue to 150 deaths. It is repugnant to think that they were referring to human victims as if they were hunting prey, whose lives have no value. Before continuing, let us delve a little deeper into the importance of these media for this story. The Tokyo Nichi Shimbun was a newspaper founded in the Japanese capital in 1872 by the writer and businessman Jono Saigiku, in partnership with the illustrator Utagawa Yoshiku. It was considered an official newspaper that merged with the Osaka Mainichi Shimbun in 1912 to form a new newspaper, although they continued to publish independently until 1943. In December 1937, 2 of its journalists, Asami Kazuo and Suzuki Jiro, wrote 4 reports on the crazy contest between Noda and Mukai. The shocking headline was, "Incredible Record for Decapitating 100 People," and reported on the healthy rivalry that both second lieutenants maintained to obtain the greatest number of heads. To make the duel more interesting, these human spoils had to be obtained by katana. The Tokyo Nichi Shimbun was in charge of updating the figures they accumulated, keeping the population entertained. The protagonists themselves were regularly interviewed to tell everything in the first person and assess their chances of winning, always in a relaxed manner. As we mentioned earlier, one of the articles reported that after the tie, they upped the stakes to 150. Here is an excerpt from those infamous publications that made the Japanese public laugh. In the hectic battle to capture the prize, they reached a record of 16 and 15 kills in one day. On the 10th day, both second lieutenants debated in a conversational tone, sword in hand. Noda said, "Hey, I have 105, how about you?" To which Mukai replied, "I have 106. Both lieutenants laughed. In the end, it didn't matter who reached 100 decapitated people first. So they raised the challenge. How about they try to kill 150 men? They suddenly reached an agreement, and the killing resumed on the 11th day of the invasion of Nanking.
During the interview, Mukai was apparently a bit upset about some damage to his sword and said, "It is mad because I sliced someone down the middle, together with his helmet." What Mukai and Noda did not mention was that in fact they were largely killing defenseless prisoners, and their victims were not killed in action, but rather murdered.
The most chilling thing is that the newspaper described the exploits of the war criminals as if it were a contest between exceptional athletes. The alleged bet between the officers was then transformed into a propaganda device that had several objectives at the same time. On the one hand, to affirm the superiority of the Japanese warrior by showing that two simple men could kill hundreds of Chinese men as if they were swatting flies with their hands. This also served to sharpen the contempt towards the nations that surrounded the archipelago. You must bear in mind that there was a strong racist component in the actions of the Japanese army. They believed that the rest of the Asian peoples were inferior and that they should succumb to Japanese control in order to grow in the future. In that sense, their vision of the world was not very different from that of their partners in the Third Reich. Finally, there was a game with the past that sought to frighten the modern soldier with the legendary samurai of yesteryear, reviving mythological glories and codes of honor such as Bushido. Of course, there was nothing honorable about the massacre of innocent and defenseless civilians by an invading force. Although the competition was presented by the Japanese press as an exaltation of the valor of modern samurai, the truth is that both soldiers did not complete their medals by demonstrating valor in individual fights, but by ending the lives of prisoners, mostly civilians, by decapitation. This is perhaps the most shameful thing in the entire history of Mukai and Noda. As we heard previously, they did not eliminate hundreds of enemies in combat, brandishing katanas on the front line. In reality, they became executioners of surrendered people totally given over to a dark fate. In addition to the murder of entire families, sexual abuse of mothers and daughters was also common during the Japanese invasion. Let us listen to the testimony of a woman who experienced the fury of men like Mukai and Noda firsthand during her time in Nanking.
看到我妈妈就睡在桌子外的，衣裳一起扒掉，我的小妹妹就死在院子里的。我姐姐呢，衣裳都没有，也不晓得给她盖，不知道就这样的。后来我们出来，摇摇这个也不呼，摇摇那个也不呼，没得一个呼人了。
You may find it strange that swords were used to commit such atrocities, but the truth is that in those times they were not an extravagant object. Rifles and firing platforms were complemented by sharp objects, an old Asian tradition that continues to this day. That is why swords were a normal thing among army officers at that time. In fact, during the same year in which the infamous bet took place, the army was equipped with a new model of gunto, a functional sword inspired by the style of traditional katanas. It was the Shin Gunto Type 94, a spectacular design that sought to revive the patriotic feeling, both in the uniformed and in civilian society. In short, it was a symbol of tradition and power that referred to Japan's past. Presumably, these were the weapons carried by Toshiaki Mukai and Tsuyoshi Noda for their particular and ruthless bet. Many historians claim that the reports in the Japanese press exaggerated the true story of what happened in Nanking to the maximum, and that the officers only killed a few people with their own hands. According to this theory, Mukai and Noda were only puppets of Japanese propaganda to increase the myth of their superiority as warriors. Although they committed heinous crimes, they are far from having achieved the incredible figures reported. The problem with this theory is that there is no evidence to support the alleged innocence of these men. What we do know is that they testified to journalists, claiming to have carried out savage torture and mass executions in which children, adults, and the elderly alike were killed. Furthermore, historical evidence of attacks on civilians in Nanjing shows that beheadings did occur and that the use of swords to massacre populations was real. We will go into this aspect of the story in more detail later, but now let us return to the gruesome events. The Nanjing massacre is usually dated between December 1937 and February 1938, a time when reports of constant killings waned as the Japanese military's attention was diverted to other fronts of conflict. Crimes committed during this episode included theft, mass rape of women, and the killing of civilians and prisoners of war by men like Noda and Mukai. Although it is difficult to establish precise figures due to the nature of the attacks, it is estimated that more than 300,000 Chinese were killed. In December 2007, the mystery surrounding the number of deaths in the Nanking massacre was once again clarified. U.S. Army documents that had previously been a state secret put the total number of dead at 500,000, taking into account what happened around the city before it was captured. In fact, Japan completely razed the region, but its troops returned home as heroes. Here we hear from journalist Shingoro Takaishi.
Proud of our Japanese soldiers, I am positive that they will not act in a repulsive manner against civilians. There may be pictures showing inhuman acts committed by Japanese soldiers, but it is improbable that what they represent is true.
In a speech upon his return from duty in Nanjing, Noda himself tried to downplay his black legend. Actually, I only killed 4 or 5 people in that way. On one occasion, we captured an enemy trench and shouted to them to come. The Chinese soldiers were so stupid that they all came in droves. We lined them up and beheaded them one after the other. I have been praised for killing 100 people, but most of it was in this way. It is true that we had this competition, but I have been asked a lot afterwards if it was worth it, and my answer is no. There was a difference between murdering innocent people and killing civilians in a military execution, even if it was totally arbitrary and promoted to amuse the invading soldiers. Mukai and Noda became something of a legend in Japan, but their exploits were soon seen as an infamy throughout the West. The sadistic officers did not expect World War II to end in an Axis defeat, but fortunately, it did. In 1947, both soldiers were arrested by U.S. personnel and sent to Sugamo Prison, located in Tokyo, Japan.
While war had come to an end in the Pacific, the Americans sought to bring some justice for the huge amount of slaughter and terror which had been caused by the Japanese. With this, they established the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, which functioned as the Nuremberg trials did, bringing scores of war criminals to justice.
After a few weeks of debate on how to deal with such prisoners, it was decided that the most appropriate course of action was to extradite them to China, to be tried as part of the investigation into the Nanking massacres. There, Mukai and Noda were in the company of other military personnel who carried out similar atrocities, such as Gunkichi Tanaka, a captain of the Japanese troops accused and convicted of killing more than 300 Chinese prisoners of war using swords, knives, and firearms. With so many records of their actions, it was not difficult to prove that Japanese soldiers had summarily executed hundreds of people in the Nanking region. Those newspapers that in 1937 described their actions as heroic acts served as proof to support the serious accusations of the Chinese government. The defense of the Japanese did not have a chance. There was no possible argument to justify such hatred and contempt for the lives of others. The only explanation was the lack of humanity that the empire generated in the minds of its troops, teaching them that the rest of the Asian nations were inferior in every way to Japan.
After hearing evidence at the trial, the men were both found guilty of atrocities committed during the Battle of Nanking, and also the massacre, and were sentenced to death.
This is how Noda, Mukai, and the aforementioned Tanaka were sentenced to the only punishment befitting their crimes: execution. On January 28, 1948, the prisoners were transported to an undisclosed location in the mountains of the Yuhuatai district. There they were lined up and shot by a firing squad. Mukai and Noda were 35 years old, while Tanaka had just turned 42. That was the end of their atrocious military careers. To this day, it is not clear whether the bet was real or whether they really achieved this macabre record. What is evident is that their racism and lack of humanity cost them their own lives. Despite the incredible details that we tell you throughout this video, within Japanese society, this competition went into obscurity for decades. It was not until 1967 that history professor Tomio Hora took it upon himself to study the event and publish a document of more than 100 pages describing everything that had happened in Nanking, focusing on the crimes of Mukai and Noda. However, the press did not pay much attention to the study, as national politics sought to leave behind the aberrations committed by the imperial force, turning a new page without taking into account the dark past that had occurred a few years earlier. But blood can only be covered up for a time. In 1971, writer Katsuichi Honda used Tomio Hora's documents to publish his own work regarding the savage bet of the officers in Nanking. A key detail is that he also appealed to testimonies and memories of the victims, interviewing dozens of Chinese survivors who narrated that nightmare in first person. In Japan, these articles sparked strong debates that continue to this day. What is most outrageous is that many conservative sectors claim that the Nanking massacre, and consequently the murders of Mukai and Noda, never happened. That it was all part of Allied propaganda against the Japanese Empire. Of course, the evidence against this theory is overwhelming. It is difficult to argue against thousands of corpses with signs of torture, mutilation, and decapitation.
Government censorship in Japan prevents any mention of incidents like the rape of Nanking. For them, the war is not a conquest, but a liberation.
As to the veracity of the accounts of Mukai and Noda's bet, the consensus is that although the official press exaggerated the situation for propaganda purposes, both officers engaged in brutality against innocent people. Despite the halo of doubt that some Japanese try to cast on these events, Noda's description of the murders coincides with what other officers who participated in the conflict have later stated. The controversy regarding the actions of these men did not remain within the military sphere. The opinions of their descendants also came into play. In 2003, the relatives of the murderers tried to bring a defamation suit against newspapers, authors, and publications that recounted the horror of Nanking. Not only that, but they sought millions in compensation for sullying the honor of their ancestors. In a landmark decision issued in 2005 and reaffirmed in 2006, the Tokyo District Court dismissed those lawsuits and clarified that, beyond the particular details about the number of victims, there is enough information to affirm that Mukai and Noda committed inhuman acts. In fact, the evidence is so abundant that one of the swords used in the massacre is still preserved in the Museum of the Chinese Armed Forces in Taipei, Taiwan. It is a sad reminder of the crimes committed by the archipelago during its time as a ruthless imperial force that advanced on the mainland. In addition, it was established that any discussion or analysis of inappropriate conduct in times of war is necessary and does not constitute an insult to people who have been dead for decades. In short, it is never too late to remember and denounce cold-blooded murderers. Japan's actions during World War II are still the subject of study. When we review the great atrocities of that time, we usually focus on what was committed by the Third Reich, but the truth is that its Asian partners did not skimp on brutality when it came to annihilating the enemy. The Nanking massacre is a clear example of this, and the infamous bet between Mukai and Noda is just one of the thousands of abuses that were carried out in those weeks between 1937 and 1938. This way, we come to the end of the video. If you like this content in which we go back to the past to analyze its darkest pages, we invite you to subscribe and activate notifications on our channel. Without further ado, we say goodbye until the next installment of Military History. Thank you for joining us.